Hello, I'm Josh Strife Hayes, and this is Strife Reads Writing Prompts. Today's prompt. It is 1941, and German troops march on a small Russian village. But once upon a time, in the early days of man, the ancestors of the people in that village struck an alliance with the Elves and other magical creatures if they ever needed aid. Now, a horn sounds in the depths of the old forest. The following story was written by Ecstaticandinsatiate, and I perform it with her kind permission. December 1941, in Ivalkovo, the USSR. Every light in the Petrov cottage was snuffed out, the wax still hot and pooling. Beds sat unmade, blankets tumbling to the floor, shoes in a neat stack by the door. Captain Felix Vogel stood in the empty one-room cabin with 5 restless boys who have not yet felt the dark thrill of squeezing a trigger and watching an animal die. They turned their guns nervously downward and watched Vogel, trying to figure out how to react. "Should we check the barn?" one ventured, whispering, even though these peasants surely did not speak German. "No," Vogel said. "They're here." He barked at the men, "Das Schuken!" and they began tearing the Petrov family home apart. They upended the kitchen table, kicked aside rugs, yanked open every unlocked door, and broke the locked ones until they too opened. They found the Petrovs huddled in a small hideaway under the family's immense bed, where grandmother, father, mother, and all 3 children slept in the winter months, coiled together like bears seeking warmth. The machine guns roared into the silent night. The soldiers obliterated the Petrovs in a brilliant spray of scarlet, all except one, the youngest child, who could not be found when the family first heard the death knell of engines growling up the dirt lane. Asya Nadia Petrov had been in the forest hunting night fairies, risking wolves and her own mother's wrath, equal terrors. She had never seen a night fairy, but her grandmother's stories were full of them. She was in the woods when the first shots rang out. She snapped her head toward her farmhouse, invisible beyond the trees, and began running toward it senseless. Asya dropped her bag, a beaded leather thing her mother had made for her, full of the precious secrets of the forest, but she kept running, too panicked to think of anything but fleeing to the safety of home. But when she reached the edge of the forest, her childhood home was already burning. A truck full of men was driving away from it, followed by another, and another, and another. Asya watched uncomprehendingly as they drove toward her village. She was 7 years old. She had heard her parents whisper about the soldiers when they thought she had fallen asleep. But they were nightmares from another world, surely. She always thought they would not really dare. But they did dare. The roof of her home collapsed in a pile of raging timber. Asya screamed when she realized what she saw, but her scream was swallowed by another much larger sound, booming up behind her. The low, billowing note of a hunting horn speared through the dark, though it was impossibly loud, louder than her own father's little thing. It reverberated across the valley like the shout of God himself. The girl turned to see the night-dark trees come suddenly to life. The creatures from her grandmother's stories came striding out of the darkness, legs as long as she was tall, moving like a willow through the wind. Some were armed with golden bows and arrows whose entire shafts rippled with cold silver flame. Others carried spears with wickedly sharp glass heads which could only be destroyed by dragonfire. They rode strange animals like something out of a fairy tale, great furred beasts which crashed through the trees on their enormous back haunches, while their smaller front limbs slashed through the underbrush, with machetes the colour of summer leaves. "Elves," Asya whispered like a prayer, remembering her grandmother's stories. How offended her grandmother became when Asya's mother called them fables. She stood still in the stampede, too stunned to know what to do. One of the elves on the furred animal stopped when he reached her. He wore armour of hardened wood, charmed to be impenetrable. His fingers were long, delicate. He had immense eyes which were almost totally black, like flat stones. Then he said, in extremely bad Russian, "You should not be here." "You're magical," she whispered. "Come," he told her, and held out his hand. Asya took the elf's hand, and he lifted her up onto his mount as if she were as light as a maple seed. She clutched the gilded saddle horn with one hand and held onto the beast's thick, curly coat with the other. The elf's armour was stiff and cool against her back. She tried not to stare at the burning skeleton of her life out there in the field. He pointed out to it and looked at her, questioningly. The girl looked at her lap and nodded. "You stay with me," he told her. "You will be safe." He sheathed his broad and brilliantly green sword and wrapped his arm instead around her middle. "I am Finway." Then Finway clicked his tongue, and his mount burst forward, leading the cavalry onward toward the trucks headed to the main village. Azure marvelled at the night forest melting away behind them as they broke the tree line and tore across the Petrov's field, full of alfalfa waiting to be cut. 3 dozen riders spurned forward together, the rest of the elven army following on foot. She turned her head to watch her house burn until it was lost behind Finway's back and she could only see the smoke blotting out the stars. Ivalkovo's main village sat in the bottom of a valley. When the elf army crested the ridge, they found the trucks already in the village. A group of shuddering villagers already illuminated in their headlights, their hands raised above their heads. Captain Vogel, who Azure would one day recognize as the man who had killed her family, snarled orders, perforating the night sky over and over again with warning shots. He must not have heard the horns over his own gun. Finway, who still had his arm firmly looped around Azure's front, whispered in her ear, "Be brave." And then they plunged forward into the valley below. Azure's throat tasted of ash. Her back and skull ached from rattling against the knot in Finway's wood chestplate, the thick hide of an oak cured with clear resin which hardened like steel. She clung to his arm as they descended into the valley. He gently pushed her head down and she folded up like a turtle receding into its shell. Finway tucked his shield over her, and Azure saw nothing but his arm. His skin was a deep and mottled green, the colour of pine. Her nose was buried in the animal's thick coat, and he smelled like their cow, Yuli, who Azure heard panicking in the barn as the impossible cavalry thundered away. Azure let herself weep, but only for a moment. She could not get scared. There was no room for fear. Her sorrow was like a deep black ocean, and she could only bear to cup it in her hands for a few seconds before letting it slip through her fingers again. Bullets screamed across the sky at them. Azure dared to raise her head over the shield for only a moment and saw that they were at the village, beside one of the huge military trucks. A soldier was falling out of it, bleeding from his belly, all black-eyed with shock. An elf stood over him, a woman with a dripping spear, who leapt onto the back of the truck and yelled a war cry Azure could not understand. Yet the howl of it made her belly rise with terrified thrill. She looked forward to see the Germans turning the shining muzzle of their guns toward Finway. Finway raised his free arm and threw up a blue wall of light, drawn out of the air itself. The bullets rattled against it like hail on a tin roof and fell harmlessly to the ground. Azure gasped her surprise. The elf looked down like he only just remembered she was there, and shoved her head under the shield again. "Stay!" he hissed at her, and this time she stayed hidden. Even when Finway leapt off his mount, bellowing commands in that same foreign language. Azure huddled under the shield, clinging to the strange animal for dear life. She tried to think of her grandmother's stories of the elves, and not the incessant, horrible pelt of machine guns emptying their bellies. She wondered if her family had time to recognize the sound before they went, but she could not think of that, not here, not now. So she thought of her grandmother, and all the late nights by the fire she would stay up telling Azure stories of witches, the firebird who stole the king's golden apples, the water czar's ingenious daughters, Vasilisar the wise. But her favourite and most forbidden were stories of elves. She drowned out the death scream of fire and men by clapping her hands over her ears and burying herself in memory. Her grandmother always said the fair folk lived in a kingdom hidden amongst the trees, that they rode steeds of light and have lived forever. Perhaps some of the details became exaggerated as they moved down the grapevine, but one story Azure knew was unshakable truth. Once, in the first days that humans came to populate the elves' forests, the two species formed a pact. The humans would till and maintain an allotted portion of the elves' land, and in exchange, the elves would keep the humans safe from any harm, human or otherwise. Azure remembered how red in the face her father got when his mother insisted it was blasphemy and idiocy to denounce the truth. "We are in the modern age," he would rage. "Stop filling my child's head with nonsense. She must be practical, useful." And then he would go out to chop wood to release his fury. Someone lifted the shield away. Azure jolted back to the present. She clutched at the shield's grip, desperately shrieking, until Finway said, "Hey, it's me." She released the shield and looked up. Relief nearly made her start sobbing. Her legs clutched the animal's sides so tightly it began to groan. "Did you kill them?" she whispered. "Most of them. The big one, you know." He waved his hand, searching for the word. "Boss went with 4, ran away. Some of your people died. Sorry." Finway offered her his hand. "You stay here." Azure knotted her fingers in the animal's fur. "No." Finway stared at her confused. His expressions were so human the wonder of it nearly distracted Arya from the biting, violet panic in her belly. "You stay," he repeated slowly as if she could not understand. "With your own people." "My family is dead. My house was burning. You saw it." Finway sucked air through his teeth and looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was looking. He had sent his mount back beyond the line of fire. They were out of sight of the cluster of lanterns in the village. Asya could still hear people weeping. She remembered seeing the baker in the light of the soldier's truck, how his eyes had been white with horror, like a cow going to slaughter. "You will be happy here," he tried again. "There's nothing for me here. I'll just be another orphan. People will look at me and think I'm just going to cost them food and money, and that's all." Finway didn't reply for a long time, perhaps translating to himself what she had said. Finally, "Humans are not supposed to enter the wood." "I know." That was true. No one in Asya's brief life had ever gone deep into the woods. There was a boundary line marking the edge of the territory, a row of golden spikes staked into the ground, tall as a full-grown man, and spaced so closely together Asya could only fit her narrow arm through up to her shoulder. None of the grown-ups would talk about it. The village had little need to hunt anyway. The river was full of fish, and enough deer could be picked off in the winter to keep the village comfortable until spring. Her grandmother said this was the elves' way of keeping their two worlds firmly separate. "Please," Asya said, her voice breaking. "I have nothing." Finway climbed into the saddle behind her and strapped his shield onto his back. He looked grimly toward the swarm of panicked humans, the elvish troops who were already most of the way out the village without them. "I will bring you," he said at last. "They may not let you stay." Asya supposed her odds did not get much better than that.